Good evening and welcome to tonight's Lockdown Learning. My name is Bran Carlil and I am the Director of Public Affairs at the Zionist Federation of Australia. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I speak, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. Knowing that this conversation is being watched in every Australian state, I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which everyone is watching this. Tonight, we will be speaking with Yohanan Plesner, the president of the Israel Democracy Institute, and the person talking to him is Rob Lehrer. Now, Rob heads a Melbourne-based family business with investments in Israel. With a long-standing involvement in social justice initiatives and numerous Israeli organizations, he is also a supporter of the Israel Democracy Institute, and it is Rob who will be introducing Yohanan tonight. So, without further ado, I'll hand the conversation over to you, Rob.
Thank you. Thank you and welcome everybody. It's great to be here tonight across from Melbourne over to Israel. I also acknowledge I'm hosting this webinar tonight from the lands of the Bunurong peoples where I'm sitting. And I also acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are participating in this webinar tonight. By way of background, I first met Yohanan a few years ago in Israel when I was introduced to him by some business associates of mine who thought I'd be very interested in the work of the IDI, the Israel Democracy Institute. And I'm pleased to say it was an excellent meeting of minds and led to a great discussion and further discussions and led to me becoming a supporter of the IDI. So hello, Yohanan, and thank you for joining us.
Hi, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Tonight, let's start off by getting a little bit of background about yourself and what led you to the IDI, and tell us, I think let's start off with that and then talk a little bit about the core aims of the organization, and we'll move on from there.
Okay, so thanks, Rob, and thanks for the Zionist Federation of Australia, and good evening to everybody. And here in Israel, you can't see my window, but it's actually before noon. So hello, everybody. My background, I was born in the UK, brought up in Jerusalem, served in Sayeret Matkal for 5 years as a combatant and officer. It's the Special Forces unit, and I still do reserves there. As a matter of fact, this morning I went for a COVID test because I have reserves later this week, and they wanted to clear all of us. Later, after the service, I went into business for a few years and then to the public service. After studying at Harvard University's Kennedy School, I served in the Knesset for about 6 years. Before that, the Secretary General of Kadima, then the ruling party set up by Sharon and later on Olmert. And after leaving politics, I joined the Israel Democracy Institute, IDI, as president of the organization. So this is about myself. And now the second part of your question about IDI.
Yes.
IDI is an impact-oriented, what we define as think and do tank. We're probably the most, the longest in town, about 30 years by now. We're going to start celebrating our 30th year within a few months. About 110 people, about 70 people on the sides of experts and scholars in all areas of that are aimed at strengthening the institutional, democratic, economic foundations of Israel. And it's basically, we're developing applied research and evidence-based knowledge to help shape policy and legislation. And we partner with professionals in the civil service, other NGOs, politicians. We're strictly nonpartisan to help develop economic reforms, structural reforms, strengthen the judiciary, the independence of the judiciary, the separation of powers between the different branches of government.
So let's have a talk,
finally, integration of the different populations, Arab, ultra-Orthodox, and so on.
Okay, so let's have a talk briefly about the democracy index that you publish, and how this came about, and what it aims to do, how it aims to define, I suppose. Does it aim to define the quality of the democracy that is each year?
Yes, well, in about 2 weeks, I'm going to present to the president of the state, Ruby Rivlin, the 2020 Democracy Index. It's a project that we've been following through since 2003. So it's going to be the 18th year, I think, that we're going to present this report. And it's a barometer of the state of Israeli democracy. What the Israeli people, it's an extended survey, and some of the questions we've been repeating for about 18 years. For example, trust in our public institutions. Some questions change every year, and we also measure Israel based on international indices on a comparative basis of the health and trends within our democracy. So as you know, Rob, liberal democracies throughout the world are not going through an easy time lately. And also Israel's democracy, while we're very proud of it, and it has some sources of inherent strength, is also going through a major crisis. And the goal of this report is to help identify and diagnose what are the challenges, what are the problems, what's working well, what needs to be addressed, and we circulate it throughout the public and decision-making community. So would you be interested if I'll share a couple of nuggets with you?
Yeah. Okay.
So I think number one, if I have to sort of select a headline to the state of democracy in Israel, I'd say that given the combination of a constitutional and political crisis that we're in, mainly as a result of the personal situation of Prime Minister Netanyahu, that coupled with the COVID-19 crisis that Israel is experiencing, like all other countries in the world, the combination of those two crises is putting tremendous pressure on Israel's democracy. And we're seeing this year, so I can't publish the numbers yet because they are in embargo until we present them to the president, but I can share that there's quite a dramatic decrease in the level of trust of Israelis in all governing institutions. The decline in trust in the government, in the Knesset, in political parties, even in the president himself, and even the institution that has the highest regard in Israeli society. You won't be surprised, it's the IDF. Even that is suffering a moderate decline.
So before we move on to the next nugget, I mean, there appear to be, and this is something that's been talked about by a lot of constitutional lawyers and scholars, there are systemic issues in Israel's democratic processes. And not only has been evidenced by 3 elections that have failed to bring about clear governments in just a short period of time, but also there are shortcomings in the founding documents of Israel, shortcomings in the electoral system. Are there realistic mechanisms for change and reform to the constitutional system and to the electoral system? And do Israelis, and you've led to some extent to this by what you've just said about the decline in confidence, do Israelis seek reform in these areas?
Well, Israelis are now sharing with us, when we measure it, what they think is not working well. There's no consensus so far about what the solutions are like, and the political system is mainly, the main political players are mainly relying on the opportunities that identity politics provides them in order to build support within specific groups, rather than turning the political arena into a competition of ideas of how to solve the problems. So we're seeing, not only is there a decline in trust in our governing institutions that I mentioned, there's also a declining trust in one another. So about 88% of Jews said it harmed, the COVID crisis harmed the relations with the Haredim, ultra-Orthodox and the non-ultra-Orthodox within Israeli society. 90% said it harmed the relationship between the public and the government. So we're seeing quite, and even the numbers of Israelis that say that Israel is a good place to live, while it's still relatively high, about 2/3, it was just a year or two ago, it was in the high 80s. So even there, we're seeing a change. There's no doubt, I think, that since the years of the second Intifada, Israel has not gone through such a difficult period in terms of the public sentiment. You are alluding to, Rob, to the remedies, to the solutions, to what can be done, and you're right. It's Israel is one of the only functioning democracies, in our case, a parliamentary liberal democracy, that does not have a constitution, except for the unique UK case. Israel has no constitution. That means that a simple majority, coalition majority in the Knesset, can change the entire fundamentals of our system, minority rights, basic freedoms, the essence of the regime. Nothing is guaranteed.
Yeah.
And so that's one issue, like constitutional reform. And you were also alluding to the need for electoral reform. And really the shortcomings of our current electoral system is mainly that it's not producing a decisive outcome, as we've seen 3 consecutive election campaigns without a conclusive outcome, and perhaps quite likely we're moving towards a 4th campaign. You'll probably ask me about it. And number 2, it provides disproportionate power to small sectorial groups that know how to work the system, mainly the ultra-Orthodox parties. So those are 2 central shortcomings that the COVID crisis has now accentuated and made very much pronounced.
Why do you say that the COVID crisis is accentuated? I mean, these problems have been present for a long time, but why has the COVID crisis accentuated those issues?
Well, because the COVID crisis is a crisis that requires a functioning government, a government that can take decisions, that can build a broad legitimacy for difficult decisions that require people to give up their, to close down their businesses, to give up on their freedom of mobility, and to leave schools shut and so on. So it requires a lot of trust in the government that decision-making is based on substantive, evidence-based criteria and not on political preferences. And what we're seeing de facto is that the government, while it wanted to introduce a quote-unquote a traffic light policy, i.e. red cities and towns and territories will have high levels of restrictions and green places the other way around. And what we're seeing de facto with the ultra-Orthodox communities, that the government has almost zero ability to impose any kind of restrictions. And while the ultra-Orthodox towns and areas had the highest levels of contamination with the virus, their education system is almost completely fully functional, whereas in the green areas where there's a secular national religious communities, kids, the vast majority of the kids are still at home. So there's a lot of distrust within the population. The decision-making is motivated. This is just one example, not by evidence-based professional criteria, but rather by motivations of who's stronger in the coalition government and is looking after their own sector.
So this leads us into a little bit of a discussion we're probably going to have later, but we might as well have it now, about the influence of the Haredi over the Haredi parties over the government. And I suppose one could argue or discuss an excessive amount of influence over government policy, and also an opposition to judicial independence is something that's often discussed as well. If that continues, are there particular parties or particular players who are more attuned to combating that? Is there a possibility, if there is another election, of what we might call a Zionist bloc, a bloc of Zionist parties that would actually not accept that Haredi influence, that could gain a majority?
Well, Rob, you asked two questions. One about the substance of ultra-Orthodox influence on the system and what it means, and then the second question is about political scenarios that can lead to any kind of change in that regard. So the short answer, and it will also answer your previous question on what's unique about the COVID crisis. The short answer is that probably one of the greatest challenges that the Jewish state is facing in the immediate and longer term future is integration of the ultra-Orthodox community into society, workplace, and into our democratic systems and institutions. Why is it such a great challenge? Because this community is about 11% of our population, but it's around 30% of our primary school Jewish kids. So and about a quarter, a little, perhaps a little more, around a quarter of all kids in Israel. So basically, the future of Israel, since it's such an important, large part of our demography, the demographic vector is very much with the ultra-Orthodox community because due to high levels of fertility. What happens within and in the interaction with the ultra-Orthodox community will in many ways determine the future of Israel, whether Israel will remain a prosperous,
a liberal democracy.
A prosperous liberal democracy. Prosperous means that it will have the high levels of human capital that can be productive and participate in a global information economy as the future labor market looks like. And it's going to be very competitive. And Israel has very strong foundations on the one hand to play an important role in such an economy. And on the other hand, when we look at the Haredi, ultra-Orthodox community today, in terms of the level of the education system, how it prepares its youngsters for the future, and in terms of compliance with democratic norms, we're seeing that if current business as usual trends continue, Israel in the future is not going to look like Israel today. And this is a major challenge. I mean, the future has not been written yet. And this is something that we at IDI are very much involved with, both in terms of analyzing and studying the trends and diagnosing the trends within the ultra-Orthodox community and helping government officials and professionals within government to devise policies for better integration of the ultra-Orthodox in the workplace, in education, in higher education, and in our democratic system as such, because there are many challenges. So this is a bit about the substantive challenge, and the COVID crisis pronounced and was like a magnifying glass for this challenge, because if people thought we can just sort of ignore it, we saw that this community, because of lack of compliance with government restrictions and regulations, had a huge effect on the fact that we rapidly rolled into a second lockdown, and it obviously aggravated many Israelis, but it also demonstrated to them that you can't just sort of ignore this challenge and continue business as if with business as usual. The last substantive point that I would mention, sorry, Rob, in this context that is relevant also for world Jewry and for the Jewish people as a whole, is that the political representatives of the ultra-Orthodox, about 15 out of 120 seats in our parliament, are extremely strict when it comes to questions of Jewish pluralism, recognition of different forms of Judaism, namely conservative and reform and so on. And in this respect, unfortunately, driving a wedge to some extent between the Jewish state and some aspects of the Jewish diaspora in a way that is in contradiction to the will of the majority of Israelis. So this is about the substance.
Well, it's an interesting question because we've discussed before, roughly 80 to 85% of Jewry around the world, most prominently in the United States, are Reform or conservative or non-aligned, but not Orthodox. And the wedge you talk about there is one that can become quite considerable, and the influence of the Haredim in not recognizing those streams of Judaism and refusing to recognize those streams of Judaism, which is not exclusive to Haredim in Israel, but how does that affect the actual community in Israel, where there are probably more secular people than there are even Reform or conservative observers?
Well, it's a great question, because you're right to make this distinction between how the very rigid line that the ultra-Orthodox parties managed to impose on Israeli governments on questions of religion and state. It has two different implications, one for the Israel diaspora relations and one for, I'd say, religious pluralism and practice within Israel. So about Israel diaspora relations, again, the vast majority of Israelis, and we follow it on IDI has the Gutman Center for Public Opinion Studies and Policy, and we've been following for years the attitude of Israelis towards the diaspora and different aspects of policy and so on. So we have ample data that can help inform the decision-making community and the public at large. And what we see is that by and large, Israelis think that the Jewish state should be a Jewish state obviously for Jews of all streams of Judaism, and be a home and not prioritize between one type of practice of Judaism and another. But Israeli government policies are not the same, because politically the ultra-Orthodox parties traditionally are very strong. It's almost impossible to form a coalition government without them. At least that was the case for quite a few years. And as a result, government policy on question of conversion, not recognizing non-Orthodox conversions within Israel, on question of funding religious services. They only fund religious services through a convoluted system that essentially means that public funding for religious services goes only for the Orthodox, and the other streams, by and large, short of a few unique cases, they need to rely on philanthropy or self-payment of the members. And that drives a wedge between Israel and as you mentioned, large parts of the diaspora. And for me, I think it's terrible, it's unfortunate, it's wrong from a Zionist perspective, and it needs to change. With respect to Israel proper, the restriction on conversions is less restrictive, because the vast majority of Israelis, even secular Israelis, do not require conversions. So it affects mainly the community of the immigrants from the former Soviet Union. We had about more than 1 million immigrants from there, and about a third are not Jews based on the halakha. And many of them, it's about 300,000, perhaps even more. And many of them would want to convert, because they have a Jewish father, but not a Jewish mother, and so on. So they're of Jewish descent, but are not Jews based on the halakha. And they tied their fate with the Jewish state. They serve in the IDF, and they want to become Jews, but the hurdles are and barriers are so great that many of them just opt out, and it's just a shame. And of course, another implication that affects the average Israeli when it comes to the monopoly of the ultra-Orthodox over religious affairs in Israel is everything that has to do with religious services and kashrut and so on, that becomes an entire industry that has many corrupt characteristics to it. And it doesn't have to be in this way. It can be done in a completely different manner. And many of the policy papers and proposals and diagnosis of the current state and its implications and costs are available in ample publications that we publish in these areas.
Is there a clash with, I mentioned briefly before about, judicial independence, but is there also a clash between halakha and the judiciary? But we don't spend all night talking about the Haredim, but is there a clash there where an activist court, a modern court, is an anathema to halachic decision-making? Is there a potentially an accommodation that can be reached there, or is there always going to be a clash?
Well, you're right. Unfortunately, there is an inherent tension between the ultra-Orthodox religious establishment and the judiciary, and mainly the Supreme Court, that is also part of its role in every democracy, and of course in ours as well, is to be the protector of individual rights, of basic rights, of rights of minorities. And Israel is a democracy, again, without a Bill of Rights. We don't have a constitution and we don't have a Bill of Rights. So the sort of guarantor of last resort of basic rights that exist within every democracy, and civil equality, for example, equality, gender equality between men and women, is the court. Now, some of those values are in contradiction to some interpretations of the halakha, namely ultra-Orthodox interpretations. And therefore, frequently, the ultra-Orthodox saw the decisions or interventions by the court when it struck down some government decisions based on the principle of equality. For example, when the court struck down the recruitment bill that was being applied unequally towards non-Orthodox, non-ultra-Orthodox Jews had to serve, and otherwise they would go to jail, and the ultra-Orthodox received a massive exemption. The court said that this arrangement is unconstitutional. This is something that I had a major role in taking in this issue as a member of Knesset in the past, and at IDI we're very involved in proposing alternative recruitment bills. But this is something obviously that the ultra-Orthodox, both the rabbis and parties, did not like, and therefore they saw the court as an institution that is to some extent hostile. So when the Prime Minister today, as a result of the Prime Minister Netanyahu, who has his own personal legal woes and legal challenges, he's been indicted for corruption charges, and when he takes on the court, he sees the ultra-Orthodox parties as a natural ally in his confrontation to weaken the independence of the judiciary.
Is it true to say that in the past, and we'll move on now to some politics, is it true to say in the past that Netanyahu actually was a strong supporter of an independent judiciary years ago, and that position has changed?
Yes, Netanyahu, both in terms of his public pronouncements and actions, he has a long revealed history of what he's been doing as a senior politician. He was prime minister between 96 and 99, a finance minister in the beginning of the 2000s, and then prime minister again since 2009. So we have a long Netanyahu history, and until about 2015, Netanyahu never supported any of the initiatives that were aimed at weakening the court system. We've been confronting a whole wave of initiatives. I would say the pronouncements began about 20 years ago, again, by some of the leaders, ultra-Orthodox leaders, some due to other reasons. Some from the settler movement also felt uncomfortable by the court because of its application of the law in Judea and Samaria in the West Bank. but it was never government policy. Since the last decade, we've been experiencing, since about 2010, a wave of dozens of initiatives that are aimed at politicizing the way we select our judges, limiting the authority of the Supreme Court, changing basic, legislating basic laws that will basically constrain the judgment of the courts and so on. And initially, Netanyahu was a key player in brushing off all of those initiatives because the Likud has a long tradition of being a national liberal party, and actually even more than Mapai in the first 30 years of Israel's history, as a party that supported in the independence of the judiciary, as liberal parties do. There was a change in the Likud over the past decade, but Netanyahu joined that over the past years, obviously not in a way that is not unconnected to his own challenge vis-a-vis the legal system. And I would also mention that Netanyahu, when Mr. Prime Minister Olmert was being interrogated, even before a decision on indicting him was made, because Olmert resigned before he was indicted back in 2008, due to those interrogations. Mr. Netanyahu was very forceful in fighting against public corruption and protecting the independence of the law enforcement institutions, including the Attorney General and so on. Netanyahu, of the past 5 years, increasingly joined with full force those who are criticizing and trying to subvert the independence of the judiciary. And now it reached a peak when as we've seen last year, that he allegedly in the coalition negotiations supported the initiative to provide absolute immunity to politicians from any kind of interrogation and prosecution and so on.
Is it fair to say then that these changes, both by Netanyahu and others, are, rather than ideological, are self-interested?
Well, the change of Netanyahu is probably based on self-interest. As I mentioned, with the ultra-Orthodox, it's an ideology. It reflects a different vision for what Israel as a Jewish and democratic state should look like. The ultra-Orthodox vision for the Zionist state is a halakha state, that Jewish law and their interpretation of Jewish law will become the law of the land. And that is, and here there's a real ideological debate that I wouldn't try to brush off, but rather it's a serious ideological debate. Is it in a complete contradiction to the spirit of Zionism as we know it from the foundation of Zionism that spoke about, basically a liberal democracy and both freedom for Jews as a people, but also securing individual freedoms. With Mr. Netanyahu himself, obviously, it would be naive not to connect it to his own personal woes, but as a result of the fact that he's such a competent politician, he manages to sway a significant portion of his own base of support in a direction that reduces the levels of trust in the Supreme Court, in the law enforcement institutions like the police and the Attorney General. And in this respect, we're in quite a low point and a very challenging point from the perspective of the soundness and stability of our law enforcement and judicial institutions.
We'll move on to a slightly different area, but it's reflective of some of the issues that you were touching on about the breadth of a democracy, and I think it relates to the joint list, we'll call it as it's known, and the Arab-Israeli population. They won 16 seats at the last election. and they represent,
15,
I think it's 1.9 million people, and 21%, roughly 22% of the population of Israel. So 16 seats in there, but they look unlikely on the basis of current political positions of the major parties, and there may be only one or two small parties that would be outliers in this, perhaps Meretz, I'm not sure of others, who they look unlikely to ever be part of a governing coalition, at least in the foreseeable future. And they look unlikely to ever really have any of their members hold significant ministerial positions because of that. How does Israel reconcile having 20% or more than 20% of the population always being a very large minority who have limited access to the power of the democratic process?
Well, this is one of the big challenges of Israel as a democracy, of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, and it's not a simple or simplistic challenge. Basically, we have, as you mentioned, they have about 15 seats in the Knesset today. The joint list that represents close to 90%, 80-something% of the Israel's Arab citizens voted for the joint list that represents this minority group. Now, so far, the political representatives of the Arab minority have not been part of coalition governments in Israel, except for a short period in the Rabin government, where they supported him from the Knesset without joining the coalition. There was some kind of a outside support, and in return for various political understandings, and this in many ways served to undermine Rabin. A lot of the criticism against Rabin, and he was labeled a traitor and so on, and all the terrible things that happened and led to the Rabin murder, a lot of it relied on the fact that he chose to build some kind of a partnership with the political representatives of the Arab minority. Now, why is it such a challenge within Israeli public opinion? So let's divide it into two, if it's okay, Rob.
Yep.
When we look at the Arab population, the population of Israeli Arab citizens, historically, it was considered illegitimate for a Arab MK to aspire to be part of a coalition or to join a government. It was, like being a traitor or something, because, Israel, the Zionist state, and so on, the ongoing conflict with the Palestinians, it's illegitimate to participate in any way with such a government. This has changed today, and that's very interesting, and we follow it very closely. We have a Jewish Arab Relations Index that a report that we produce every year, and we follow the trends, and we're seeing that more and more Arab citizens expect their political representatives to be part of a coalition, because they have, day-to-day pragmatic needs of fighting against crime and developing their towns and villages and so on. So they actually sort of have evolved and expect their politicians. They even moved farther than what their politicians were willing to do. Now, what's happening in the Jewish majority or the Jewish side? Here, it's more challenging. For the average Israeli, when we look at this, a component of the identity of Israel's Arab citizens is Palestinian. Obviously, many of them, for a tiny minority, it's the first identity component. If a tiny minority say, first and foremost, we're Palestinian. The majority say, first we're Arab, or first we're Muslim. Some say, first we're Israeli citizens, but all of them, to some extent, also see themselves as Palestinians. And as long as we have an active conflict with the Palestinians in Gaza, in the West Bank, and an Israeli government will have to make decisions of war and peace vis-a-vis Palestinians and Hamas and Fatah and so on, and the Palestinian Authority. For the average Israeli, it's a conflict that cannot be reconciled. The fact that a government will depend on, for its survival, on the votes of the representative of Israeli Palestinians, and we'll have to make decisions of war and peace vis-a-vis the Palestinians. The average Israeli says this government will not be able to look after our security properly. So there's a real challenge, because on the one hand, you presented it correctly, that a big portion of our citizens do not gain real effective political representation. On the other hand, there's an ongoing conflict, and as long as the conflict will continue, it will continue to be a big challenge to properly integrate the Arab minority into our politics. Having said that, and sorry for the long
no, that's okay.
intervention. Having said that, over the past year and a half, some progress has been made. The fact that the representatives of the joint list have recommended Mr. Gantz to the president to form the coalition is something that never happened in the past. In the past, they would go and say, we're indifferent. And now, for the first time, they sort of aligned themselves with the center left bloc. I mean, it's one step forward. Gantz himself did not want them to join his coalition against for the reasons that I mentioned before, but there's some kind of a progress taking place. Now, as long as those 15 or so seats that represent the Arab minority will continue to be outside of coalition give and take, this will continue to provide the 15 of the ultra-Orthodox almost a monopoly of deciding who will be prime minister. Because once those 15 are out, you need the 15 of the ultra-Orthodox. It's virtually impossible to form a coalition without them. So this is how we can link the two issues. You spoke about the ultra-Orthodox and Jewish pluralism issue, the fact that the Arabs are considered still a sort of partially legitimate participants in our fully fledged politics, very much empowers the ultra-Orthodox, and therefore there are elements within our system that have a very strong interest not to help this process of integration of the Arab participation, but the other way around.
So you mentioned that a recommendation by the joint list for Benny Gantz, which of course he didn't really want to be a public recommendation for reasons that you mentioned. We'll move on to a little bit about the current political situation in terms of the parliament or the Knesset and where it goes, because at the moment we've had a situation where a lot of senior positions have not been appointed or been very slow to be appointed in the civil service and other senior positions, where obviously the COVID crisis was not handled ideally. Mind you, it hasn't been handled ideally in many places. So it's not that Israel's exclusive in that area, but
except for Australia.
Yeah, Australia's is the gold standard, as we like to tell ourselves. Politicians constantly tell us. But yes, Australia has handled it relatively well. Where does it go now? Talk of a fourth election in a short period of time or not? Where is it heading? Will Gantz be prime minister?
Well, what we've, as I mentioned in the opening remarks, alongside with the COVID crisis, we're in an ongoing political and constitutional crisis that is unprecedented. We've gone through 3 consecutive election campaigns, March 19, September 19, March 2020, and the common wisdom within the political system today is that in March 2021 we're going to enter a 4th election campaign. Now, that is also a demonstration of the inherent weaknesses of our political system, electoral system that does not produce a decisive outcome. But it's first and foremost as a result of the unique situation of a prime minister who's been indicted, who is his regular court proceedings are expected to. The court itself began, but the regular The daily proceedings are expected to begin in January. He's expected to be 3 days a week in court. He's been indicted in accusations that might lead to incarceration. So there's much at stake personally for the prime minister. And rather than stepping aside and trying to clear his name in court, he chose a different strategy of basically taking on the judicial system and dragging his party and political allies with him into the struggle. The implication of that is that even after three election campaigns, when a government was set up, a national unity government, supposedly in order to deal with the COVID crisis, a broad parliamentary base that will be able to instigate economic reforms, deal with the health implications of the crisis. So they really built a sort of a government that was designed to have broad parliamentary shoulders to deal with the crisis and lead us, navigate us through this crisis. And this government was established in just half a year ago.
Yep.
What happened de facto is that from day one of the establishment of this government, it was established on the principle of parity between Gantz's blue and white bloc and Netanyahu's Likud bloc, parity in decision making, that they need to basically, they have mutual veto power and they need to agree on everything, and that in November 2021, Gantz will replace Netanyahu as prime minister. Those were the basic principles. But Mr. Netanyahu basically does not want this rotation in power, does not want to give up the premiership in November 21.
Can I ask, did anyone ever believe he did, that he would stick to that arrangement?
Since they did not believe it, they created a constitutional change. They legislated a basic law that basically defined that by law, Gantz, without any active decision by anyone, will slide into the decision of prime minister. The best lawyers came up with this constitutional, awkward, if not crooked construct. But, you know, when you want to look for a loophole, there's always one. And the loophole was that if a budget is not passed, they all agreed that they will pass immediately a budget for for the remaining part of 2020 and 2021 to deal with the crisis. The loophole is that if the budget is not passed, then there's a way, then the Knesset disintegrates automatically, and Netanyahu does not have to give up the premiership. And that's why Netanyahu prevents the 2021 budget from being passed. And as a result of that political and legal given confrontation, Israel is managing the worst, is going through the worst economic crisis and recession in its foreseeable history, without a budget. And the fact that nominations are not made is because it's trying to prevent the nomination. We need to nominate a new attorney general or state prosecutor, because we're now almost a year without a state prosecutor, a new chief of police, because we're almost 2 years without a chief of police, a new director general of the justice ministry, and all of those leaders of the law enforcement system. Mr. Netanyahu is now confronting them in court, and he wants to make sure that those are nominations that are comfortable to his legal process, and therefore he vetoes all of these nominations. So basically, the country's functioning, rather than having a broad unity government that makes significant decisions and instigates reforms to deal with that crisis, we have a government that de facto operates as an interim government that makes no decisions, not on a budget, not on nominations, and it's basically a captive of the legal confrontation of the prime minister. And in this respect, it's also moving towards an election, but also losing its legitimacy in a government. And although Israelis are tired of those consecutive election campaigns, they're increasingly realizing that perhaps that's the only way to get out of get out of the deadlock.
The question then becomes, if there is an election, And I was going to talk about economics, but we're probably a little short on time to get into that because you mentioned about the recession, but maybe for another time. But on the politics, so we've seen in polling and in various other areas the rise of Yamina's popularity, what appears to be on some of the latest predictions that they would win maybe 22 seats in the Knesset for a party that had nearly disintegrated not long ago. It's a remarkable turnaround. And Naftali Bennett, who was on the verge of being nowhere, is suddenly potentially again a very major player. How does that go forward? Where do you think they will sit, and how would potentially, let's say an election was called in a few months' time, how is it looking?
Well, it's you just presented some of the another evidence for the roller coaster of politics. Naftali Bennett that didn't cross the threshold in March or April 2019 and almost vanished as a politician, is now considered, if after Mr. Netanyahu, he has the highest ratings for fit for premiership in the Israeli public, and is considered probably the biggest threat to the prime minister as he contemplates whether or not to go for an early election. He sees Bennett, his former close ally and chief of staff, as his main aide. Now, how did this dynamic evolve? Basically, Bennett was left out of the Netanyahu coalition. Netanyahu wanted to do away with him. And as a result of the perception by the general public that the COVID crisis is managed poorly and with the wrong motivations in mind, we have the most bloated government in Israel's history with 30-something ministers, and as about 1 million Israelis became unemployed, the government created new ridiculous ministries and new positions that were not required, just to sort of allow for politicians to fulfill roles and so on. Naftali Bennett challenged all of that and challenged also the way the COVID crisis is managed from a health perspective, and a lot of the disappointment, both from the base of Likud supporters with the prime minister's conduct. A lot of that support went to Bennett. Also, some of those who were supported blue and white and they're disappointed by Gantz's stuttering and inconclusive conduct also moved towards Bennett. And what we're seeing now is, Bennett, it's true, as you mentioned, has more than 20 seats in the polls, but it's very tenuous because it's a very he has both disappointed blue and white supporters, disappointed settlers who are disappointed with Netanyahu for not pushing ahead with annexation. So he sort of oversees a very broad and uncohesive coalition of supporters, and the number to look out for if we want to see Bennett challenging Netanyahu in any way is whether Bennett plus Lapid, Gantz, basically the Zionist parties that are not Likud and the ultra-Orthodox, will have more than 61 seats. If that will be the case, that will open up an opportunity for a unity government of center-right plus center-left forces that will focus on the COVID crisis. I'm not sure what likelihood that has, but it's but if Netanyahu is to be replaced, this is probably the most likely scenario. But if I have to predict the future, assuming we are going for an election, it's more likely that ultimately Bennett will go back to building an alliance with Netanyahu. Netanyahu doesn't like Bennett, Bennett doesn't like Netanyahu, and both of them will have to sort of work together, and that's a more likely outcome.
Yep. They seem more natural allies, ultimately still ideologically, that Likud would be there with Yamina rather than...
Yeah, but I wouldn't underestimate Bennett's ambition. Yeah, but I wouldn't underestimate Bennett's ambition to become prime minister. His disappointment with Netanyahu, not nominating, not managing the crisis with a impartial and professional manner, and and also his sort of personal frustration with Netanyahu that basically threw him out of the coalition, and therefore, if Bennett will have the numbers, I think he will try to form something with Netanyahu out, but I find it quite difficult to imagine that he will remain with the same numbers, given the fact that his coalition is so varied from extreme right-wing supporters, and even his own faction has elements like Smotrich and his people that are completely opposed to the idea of building a coalition with centrist forces and prefer holding on to the old alliance with the ultra-Orthodox and the Likud. So, I mean, a lot of things have to come together for Bennett to challenge Netanyahu, but so far it looks like a more threatening challenge to Netanyahu than a challenge from the center left, that if, that Gantz led that camp before, and now that Gantz's leadership ratings have plummeted, no one else managed to sort of replace him. And even Lapid, who's trying to fill that vacuum, so far in terms of the numbers, he's still not there.
We've only got a few minutes left, but one question I wanted to ask you is about the demonstrations in Israel. And demonstrations are often seen as a sign of a thriving democracy, is that people are allowed to demonstrate. Of course, in Australia, even in thriving democracies like Australia, there's been limitations on demonstrations during COVID, controversial in many ways, for many reasons. Are these demonstrations continuing? Do they have real force? Are they a democratic uprising of people, or are they just a disgruntled group of people that would seem quite predictable, perhaps?
Well, good question. It's something big is happening on the one hand. Based on the numbers that we've gathered, and we've been doing polling also throughout the COVID crisis to understand the various aspects of it. We can tell that about 1 in 10 Israelis went out to demonstrate over the past few months. So about 900,000 Israelis went out to demonstrate, either next to the Prime Minister's home, in the junctions, every Saturday night. We have about hundreds of demonstrations throughout the country that are demonstrating mainly against Mr. Netanyahu and the fact that he's managing the country in a situation of a severe conflict of interest, no trust in him as a result of the legal allegations, and the fact that he's, the government is not making decisions and poorly managing the crisis as a result of his corruption cases and so on. So that's the main claim of the demonstrators. And again, 900,000 is a huge number. I mean, compared to Australia with 20-something million people, it would mean that more than 2 million Australians will go out to demonstrate. I find it quite difficult to imagine such a reality. So that's on the one hand. It's not a phenomenon to be overlooked or disregarded as some kind of a marginal affair. Yeah. And they continue every Saturday and during the week and on the networks. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, those who there are two types of disgruntlements against the government. One is about Netanyahu and his conflict of interest and the fact that he's charged with severe charges of corruption. And the demonstrators are demonstrating mainly against that and the implications of that on the government. Yep. And there's another sense of disgruntlement, and this is about the economic management of the crisis and about the economic situation. And the demonstrations do not so much focus on that, but this is where a majority of Israelis from left, right, and center are very much critical of the government. And in this respect, if the demonstrations and protests would have been perceived more as focused less on Netanyahu and more on the economic situation, they would have been able to sway an even bigger portion and more varied portion of Israelis. Yeah. Since it's more focused on that aspect, I think that the political implications, assuming we're going to have an election, will be that it will fire up the anti-Netanyahu base, but it won't have implications in moving people from side to side. And in this respect, the implications, I expect them to be limited.
Yeah, thank you. We're going to have to finish up in a minute. I would have loved to have gone into a bit more about the economic situation and the effect it's having, especially in some of the areas of, well, we'll go into it another time, but it's hopefully. So I want to thank you very much for joining us tonight. It's been a wonderful discussion. I want to thank some of the people who've put up questions. We did get to quite a few of them. I didn't mention them by name or anything, but they were woven into the topics we discussed to a great extent, which was good. And I really look forward to seeing you in Australia soon. I don't know how soon, but I know you're going to get here. I might see you in Israel first, but I hope it's not too far away. And thank you. And I'll hand back to Bren to finish up.
So thanks for having me. And I've been last in Australia 23 years ago and love to come back. And thanks for the Zionist Federation for putting it together.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you, Yohanan. It would, of course, be wonderful to have you here, and you know, let's hope we can make that happen in the coming months or years. Look, that conversation went very quickly tonight. I couldn't believe it when I looked at the time, and it was almost 9 o'clock here in Melbourne. I'd love to engage you in much longer conversation. The fact that we had so many questions, I think everyone else did as well. Look, as everyone knows, tonight is our last lockdown learning. After 32 weeks of doing this, it's now still daylight outside when we start, and there's no lockdowns left anywhere in Australia, not even in Adelaide. So it's time to pull up stumps. It's not the end of ZFA online events, of course, and next year, as physical restrictions are hopefully reduced even more, we'll be reintroducing physical events, though I am sure that they will still have an online element to them. Putting together 32 weeks of online conversations with disparate guests and moderators and time zones would not have been possible without the help of a lot of people. Jeanette Searle, Emily Gian, Moria Ben David, and Eti Aloni helped an incredible amount with ideas and their amazing contact lists. There were also many others, and too many to mention, that helped here and there to pull the conversations together each week. I also want to thank all of you for tuning in each week to hear such a diverse range of views about so many aspects of Israel. So that's it for tonight. Have a great week, and thank you for joining us on Lockdown Learning.